They bound her hands behind the wooden stake while she still wore her wedding dress. The white fabric, now torn and stained with dirt, fluttered in the desert wind as Reverend Judson Pryor raised his arms toward the gathering crowd. But what they didn't know was that the man stumbling through the back of the crowd, reeking of whiskey and barely able to stand, was about to change everything with a single desperate shot into the air. Clementine Cross stood with her back pressed against the rough wood, her red hair catching the harsh midday sun. Her green eyes swept across the faces of people she had known her entire life, searching for someone, anyone, who might speak for her. The rope bit into her wrists as she struggled against the bindings, but the knots held firm. "Brothers and sisters," Reverend Pryor's voice boomed across the town square, "we gather today to cleanse our community of the darkness that has plagued our livestock and poisoned our wells." His cold gray eyes fixed on Clementine as murmurs rippled through the crowd of 40 or 50 townspeople. "This woman has confessed to her unholy practices." "I never confessed to anything," Clementine called out, her voice cracking but defiant. "You forced those words from me." The Reverend's thin smile never wavered. "The devil speaks through her even now." He gestured to two men holding torches near bundles of dry brush stacked around the base of the stake. "Let the cleansing fire burn away her corruption and protect our righteous community." Near the back of the crowd, Boone Delaney swayed on unsteady legs, squinting through bloodshot eyes at the scene before him. His weathered brown hat sat crooked on his head, and his shirt bore the stains of 3 days' drinking. The bottle in his hand was nearly empty, but something about the young woman's voice cut through his whiskey fog. Somewhere in the crowd, Nolan Graves kept his head down, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. The man who should have been Clementine's husband by now had vanished when the accusations began, leaving her to face the charges alone. His absence spoke louder than any testimony. "Light the kindling," Reverend Pryor commanded, and the torchbearers stepped forward. Clementine's chest rose and fell rapidly as the reality of her situation crashed over her. The dry brush caught fire quickly, small flames beginning to lick upward toward her feet. The crowd stepped back from the growing heat, but she had nowhere to go. That's when Boone Delaney's alcohol-clouded mind suddenly cleared, and he realized what he was witnessing. His hand moved to the revolver at his hip, fingers closing around the worn grip. But what he was about to do would expose secrets that Reverend Pryor had buried for years, secrets that would turn this execution into something far more dangerous than anyone could imagine. The gunshot cracked through the air like thunder, sending birds scattering from nearby trees and causing the entire crowd to freeze in place. Boone Delaney stood with his smoking revolver pointed skyward, swaying but somehow more focused than he had been in months. The flames at Clementine's feet hesitated, as if the sound itself had startled them. "Stop this madness," Boone called out, his voice hoarse but carrying across the silent square. "You're about to murder an innocent woman." Reverend Pryor's face darkened as he turned toward the drunken cowboy. "How dare you interrupt the Lord's justice with your drunken foolishness? Guards, remove this man immediately." 3 burly townsmen stepped forward, but Boone kept his gun drawn, though pointed safely away from the crowd. "I know what really killed those cattle, Pryor, and it wasn't witchcraft." A murmur ran through the gathered people as uncertainty crept into their faces. Clementine's eyes widened with desperate hope, even as the heat from the flames below grew more intense. "The ravings of a drunk hold no weight here," the Reverend declared, but something in his voice had changed. A slight tremor betrayed his growing nervousness. "Continue with the execution. Then explain why I saw you dumping barrels of something into Willow Creek 3 nights ago," Boone pressed on, his words slurring slightly but his meaning clear. "Right upstream from where the cattle drink." The crowd began to shift restlessly. Several people exchanged worried glances, and the torchbearers hesitated instead of moving closer to Clementine. The young woman watched this exchange with growing comprehension, realizing that her fate might hang on the words of a man most people dismissed as worthless. From somewhere in the crowd, Bertie Sloan stepped forward. The elderly woman's weathered face was grave as she spoke. "I've lived in this town for 60 years, and I've never seen anything like what's been happening to our animals." Her voice carried the authority of age and experience. "Maybe we should listen to what this man has to say." Reverend Pryor's jaw clenched visibly. "This woman has confessed. The matter is settled." "I confessed to nothing," Clementine shouted again, and this time more people seemed to hear her. "He kept me locked in that cellar for 2 days without food or water, until I was too weak to think straight." The flames had reached higher now. close enough that Clementine could feel them singing the hem of her wedding dress. Sweat beaded on her forehead from the heat, and she pressed herself as far back against the stake as possible. Boone took a staggering step forward, his revolver still in hand. "Cut her loose, Pryor. Before you do something you can't undo." "Never," the Reverend snarled, and gestured sharply to his men. "Finish this now." But as the guards moved to restrain Boone and the torchbearers advanced on Clementine, none of them noticed Bertie Sloane quietly slipping away from the crowd. She had remembered something crucial about those barrels, something that would prove far more damaging to Reverend Pryor than anyone could possibly imagine. The guards rushed toward Boone, but he stumbled backward, keeping his distance while waving the revolver erratically. The crowd scattered in different directions, some trying to get away from the gunman, others pressing closer to see what would happen next. Clementine cried out as the flames rose higher, now reaching the bottom of her dress. "You're all making a terrible mistake," Boone shouted, his words echoing off the wooden buildings surrounding the square. "That girl never hurt anybody, but your precious Reverend has been poisoning your water supply for weeks." "Lies from a drunk," Reverend Pryor snapped, but sweat had begun to form on his brow despite the cool morning air. "Seize him immediately." The largest of the guards, a man named Curtis with arms like tree trunks, lunged forward and grabbed Boone's gun arm. The two men struggled, and the revolver fired again, this time into the dirt near the crowd's feet. Women screamed and men dove for cover, creating chaos in the town square. During the commotion, Clementine managed to work one hand partially free from the rope. The flames had caught the bottom of her wedding dress, and she frantically tried to stamp them out while still bound to the stake. The heat was becoming unbearable, and black smoke was starting to fill her lungs. "Help me," she gasped, but most of the crowd was too focused on the fight between Boone and Curtis to notice her desperate situation. Just then, Bertie Sloane emerged from behind the general store, dragging something heavy across the dirt. In her weathered hands, she carried a wooden barrel with strange stains around its rim. The elderly woman's face was grim with determination as she approached the chaos. "Stop this madness right now," Bertie called out, in a voice that cut through the noise like a blade. The authority in her tone made everyone pause, even Curtis and Boone, who were still wrestling over the gun. She tilted the barrel toward the crowd, revealing its contents. A thick, oily liquid sloshed inside, giving off a chemical smell that made several people step back and cover their noses. Dark residue coated the interior walls of the container. "I found this behind the church," Bertie announced, her voice carrying to every corner of the square, along with 6 others just like it, all empty and all reeking of the same poison that's been killing our cattle. Reverend Pryor's face went white as fresh snow. His mouth opened and closed wordlessly, and for the first time since the execution began, he seemed to have lost control of the situation. The crowd turned toward him with growing suspicion, but Clementine's situation was becoming desperate. The flames had spread up her dress, and she could feel the heat burning her skin. Her partially freed hand clawed frantically at the ropes, but she was running out of time. What none of them realized was that Nolan Graves was watching from the shadows between 2 buildings, and he had just made a decision that would change everything about this confrontation. Nolan Graves burst from the shadows between the buildings, running toward Clementine with a bucket of water in his hands. The crowd gasped as the man who had abandoned his bride suddenly appeared, splashing the contents across the flames at her feet. Steam hissed upward as the fire retreated, giving Clementine precious moments of relief. "Cut her loose," Nolan shouted to anyone who would listen, pulling a knife from his belt to saw at the ropes binding her wrists. This has gone too far. But Reverend Pryor was not finished. His initial shock at seeing the poison barrel had transformed into desperate rage. "That barrel proves nothing," he declared, his voice rising to match the chaos around him. "This is clearly a conspiracy to protect the witch. Nolan Graves has been corrupted by her evil influence." The crowd wavered uncertainly. Some moved closer to help Clementine, while others stepped back, still influenced by the Reverend's words. The division in the community was becoming clear, with neighbors looking suspiciously at each other. Boone finally wrestled his gun away from Curtis and stood breathing heavily, but his brief moment of clarity was fading as the alcohol reasserted its hold on his mind. "Tell them about the mining company, Pryor," he slurred, swaying dangerously. "Tell them why you really needed to poison the creek." "Mining company?" Bertie Sloane's eyes narrowed as she studied the Reverend's increasingly panicked expression. "What mining company?" Reverend Pryor's hands trembled as he realized his carefully constructed facade was crumbling. "There is no mining company. This drunk is hallucinating." But Nolan had successfully cut through most of Clementine's bonds, and she was able to step away from the smoldering stake. Her wedding dress was burned and blackened, but she was alive. Her green eyes blazed with fury as she faced her accuser. "Tell them the truth, Judson," she said, using his first name with deliberate disrespect. "Tell them about the silver deposits you found under the creek bed. Tell them how you needed the cattle dead so people would sell their land cheap." The Reverend's mask finally fell away completely. "You know nothing. Girl, I know you offered to marry me to Nolan so you could get access to my family's land," Clementine continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I know you've been buying up property from desperate ranchers for months, and I know you were going to frame me for the cattle deaths to cover your tracks." A stunned silence fell over the crowd as the implications of her words sank in. The religious leader they had trusted was revealed as a fraud who had been systematically destroying their livelihoods for personal gain. But as the townspeople began to turn against Reverend Pryor, none of them noticed the 3 armed men who had just ridden into town. The Reverend's business partners had arrived, and they had no intention of letting their profitable scheme be exposed by a woman who should have been dead by now. The 3 horsemen approached slowly, their hands resting casually on their gun belts as they surveyed the chaotic scene in the town square. Their leader, a scarred man with cold eyes and a black hat, dismounted first. His boots hit the dirt with deliberate heaviness, and the crowd instinctively stepped back. "Reverend Pryor," the scarred man called out in a voice like gravel. "Seems you've got yourself a problem here." Pryor's relief was visible as he recognized his business associates. "Thank goodness you've arrived, Mr. Kane. This situation has gotten completely out of hand." Clementine felt Nolan's protective arm around her shoulders as they both realized the danger had just multiplied. The charred remains of her wedding dress clung to her frame, and ash streaked her face, but her eyes remained defiant. Boone Delaney, still unsteady from drink, squinted at the newcomers. Something about them triggered a memory buried deep in his alcohol-fogged mind. "I know you," he mumbled, pointing an unsteady finger at Kane. "You're the one who's been buying up all the land downstream." Kane's hand moved closer to his gun. "Old drunk doesn't know what he's talking about." But Bertie Sloan stepped forward, still clutching the poison barrel. "Maybe he does. Maybe that's why you needed those cattle dead so bad, so folks would sell cheap to your mining operation." The tension in the square grew thick as more pieces of the conspiracy became clear. The townspeople began to understand they had been manipulated by their own spiritual leader, and anger replaced their earlier confusion. "None of this matters now," Kane declared, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "The girl was legally condemned. The execution should proceed." "Like hell it will," Nolan said, pulling Clementine closer. His earlier cowardice had been replaced by fierce determination. Kane smiled coldly and gestured to his 2 companions, who remained mounted but had drawn their weapons. "I don't think you understand the situation here, boy. This town belongs to us now." Reverend Pryor tried to regain control. "Citizens, these men are here to restore order. The witch must still face justice." But the crowd was no longer listening to him. The poison barrel, Clementine's accusations, and now the arrival of armed strangers had shattered their faith in his leadership. Several of the townsmen had begun reaching for their own weapons. "You poisoned our water," called out one rancher whose cattle had died. "You destroyed our livelihoods." The situation was rapidly spiraling toward violence, but what none of them had noticed was that Boone Delaney had quietly circled around behind the mounted gunmen. Despite his drunken state, his military training from years past was slowly surfacing, and he had just spotted something that would give him the advantage he needed to turn this confrontation in their favor. Boone noticed that the 2 mounted gunmen had positioned themselves poorly, their horses nervous from the smoke and chaos. Years of cavalry experience told him they would have trouble drawing and aiming quickly from their current positions. More importantly, he could see that Kane's confidence came from believing he controlled the situation completely. The scarred leader stepped closer to Clementine and Nolan, his hand now resting on his gun grip. "Girl, you've caused enough trouble today. Time to finish what was started." "Stay back," Nolan warned, but his voice lacked the conviction of a man used to violence. Kane laughed harshly. "You think you can protect her? I've killed men twice your size for far less than what she's cost us." The crowd was growing more agitated by the moment. Several townsmen had armed themselves, but they seemed uncertain about taking action against professional gunfighters. The standoff stretched taut, As everyone waited for someone to make the first move, Reverend Pryor tried to reassert his authority. As the spiritual leader of this community, I order you all to stand down and allow justice to proceed. Your kind of justice? Bertie Sloan spat, hefting the poison barrel higher. You've been lying to us for months, Judson Pryor, poisoning our animals, stealing our land, and now you want to murder an innocent girl to cover it up. The Reverend's face twisted with rage. She is not innocent. I have proof of her corruption. What proof? Clementine demanded, stepping forward despite Nolan's restraining hand. The same proof you manufactured to justify burning me alive? Kane grew impatient with the arguing. Enough talk. His gun cleared leather in one smooth motion, the barrel aimed directly at Clementine's heart. This ends now. That was the moment Boone had been waiting for. The instant Kane's attention focused completely on his target, Boone moved with surprising speed for a drunk man. He lunged forward and grabbed the reins of the nearest horse, causing the animal to rear and throw its rider to the ground. The second mounted gunman tried to swing his weapon toward Boone, but his horse shied away from the commotion, spoiling his aim. The shot went wide, shattering the window of the general store. In the chaos that followed, the townspeople finally found their courage. Men who had been hesitant moments before now rushed forward, some tackling Kane, while others moved to help Boone subdue the remaining gunmen. But Reverend Pryor was not finished. In the confusion, he had pulled a hidden pistol from beneath his dark robes, and his wild eyes fixed on Clementine with murderous intent. If he was going down, he was determined to take her with him. Reverend Pryor's finger tightened on the trigger as he aimed directly at Clementine's chest. His face was twisted with desperate fury, knowing that his carefully constructed empire was crumbling around him. But just as he was about to fire, Bertie Sloan swung the heavy poison barrel with both hands, striking him across the shoulder and sending his shot wild. The bullet splintered the wooden post behind Clementine, missing her by inches. Pryor stumbled sideways, clutching his injured arm, but managed to keep hold of his weapon. You meddling old woman, he snarled at Bertie, raising the gun toward her instead. Before he could fire again, Nolan threw himself between them, taking the bullet in his left shoulder. He cried out in pain but didn't fall, his newfound courage keeping him on his feet as blood soaked through his shirt. The sight of Nolan being shot galvanized the entire crowd. Even those who had been hesitant before now surged forward with righteous anger. Pryor found himself surrounded by furious townspeople who had finally seen through his deception. Meanwhile, Kane and his men were being overwhelmed by the sheer number of citizens fighting against them. Boone, despite his drunken state, had managed to wrestle a gun away from one of the fallen riders and was helping to keep the remaining gunmen pinned down. It's over, Pryor, Clementine said, pressing a torn piece of her dress against Nolan's bleeding shoulder. Tell them everything. Tell them about the silver mine, the poisoned cattle, and how you plan to steal everyone's land. The Reverend's wild eyes darted around the circle of angry faces surrounding him. His gun wavered in his trembling hand as he realized there was no escape. You don't understand, he said desperately. This town was dying. The mine would have brought prosperity to everyone. Prosperity for you, you mean? Called out the rancher whose cattle had been killed, while the rest of us lost everything. Bertie stepped closer, still holding the empty poison barrel. How many animals did you kill with this poison, Judson? How many families did you drive to ruin? Pryor's composure finally shattered completely. I did what was necessary. The land was worthless without the mining rights. I was going to make this place important. By murdering an innocent girl? Boone's voice cut through the accusations, clearer now than it had been all day. By burning her alive to cover your tracks? The Reverend's gun hand dropped to his side as the weight of his crimes became undeniable. Around him, the people he had deceived and manipulated closed in, their faces showing no mercy for the man who had betrayed their trust so completely. Kane made one last desperate attempt to break free from his captors, but the townspeople had him thoroughly subdued. His business partnership with Pryor had cost him everything, and now both men would face the consequences of their greed. But the most important revelation was yet to come, as Clementine prepared to expose the final piece of evidence that would ensure these men could never hurt anyone again. Clementine reached into the charred folds of her wedding dress and pulled out a folded piece of paper, somehow preserved despite the flames and chaos. Her hands shook slightly as she unfolded it, revealing handwritten text in Reverend Pryor's distinctive script. This is a contract, she announced, her voice carrying clearly across the now silent square. An agreement between Judson Pryor and the Kane Mining Company to purchase all the land around Willow Creek for 1/10 its actual value. once the current owners were forced to sell due to livestock losses. The crowd pressed closer to hear every word as she continued reading. It includes detailed plans for poisoning the water supply and instructions for disposing of anyone who might expose the scheme. Her green eyes fixed on Pryor's horrified face. It's signed and dated 3 months ago. Pryor lunged desperately toward her, trying to grab the damning document, but several townsmen seized him before he could reach it. His weapon clattered to the ground, and his struggles were futile against so many determined hands. "Where did you get that?" Kane demanded from where he knelt with his hands bound behind his back. "From your saddlebags," Boone said with a grim smile, his words clearer now as the alcohol continued to wear off. "While you were all arguing, I took the liberty of searching your horses, found quite a few interesting papers." The truth was finally complete. The townspeople now understood the full scope of the conspiracy that had nearly destroyed their community and claimed an innocent life. Justice was swift and decisive. Within an hour, Kane and his men were secured in the town jail, along with Reverend Pryor. The contracts and poison barrels provided all the evidence needed to ensure they would face trial for their crimes. Word was sent to the territorial marshal, who would arrive within days to transport them to the county seat. Nolan's shoulder wound, though painful, proved to be minor. As Bertie Sloan bandaged him properly, he looked into Clementine's eyes with genuine remorse. "I'm sorry I ran when you needed me most," he said quietly. "I was a coward." Clementine studied his face for a long moment before responding. "You came back when it mattered. That's what counts now." But it was Boone Delaney who surprised everyone most. The man who had stumbled into the square drunk and seemingly worthless had become the unlikely hero who exposed the conspiracy and saved the day. As he stood looking at the smoldering remains of the execution stake, he made a decision that would change his life. "I'm done with the bottle," he announced to anyone who would listen. "This town needs a sheriff who's sober enough to protect it." The townspeople, grateful for his intervention, were more than willing to give him that chance. Boone Delaney, former drunk and unlikely savior, pinned on a badge that afternoon and began the hard work of rebuilding both his life and the community's trust. Clementine Cross walked free, her name cleared, and her future restored. The nightmare that had nearly cost her life was over, and justice had prevailed through the courage of ordinary people who refused to let evil triumph. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale from the frontier, where honor and justice collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.